Compeer Financial sponsoring the session.
What's your plan for the future?
When others told me my plans weren't possible, Compeer Financial saw potential. They helped me diversify my operation and find new paths to succeed. Compeer understood that I needed to expand more than acreage to grow my operation.
We kept hearing about the challenges of living out here, but Compeer saw possibilities. They worked with us, going through the details in ways we could understand. Compeer made buying our forever home easier than we ever dreamed.
Compeer understood what the next generation of our dairy needed to succeed. They knew exactly where we wanted to go and guided us every step of the way. Thanks to Compeer, we've set up our family dairy to keep growing into the future.
Partner with us to make your goals possible.
I'd like to introduce Peter Wright. He's a professional engineer licensed in New York State. He works part-time as an ag engineer in the Department of Animal Sciences at Cornell in Ithaca. And he assists the dairy environmental systems and soil and water engineering components of Cornell's Pro Dairy program, concentrating on sustainability for dairy farms, greenhouse gases and water quality issues, as well as environmental practices for farms. He grew up in New York State on a dairy farm, performing manure management chores. He has worked for over 40 years helping farms develop their manure management system. He has a BS and a Master's of Engineering from Cornell in Ag Engineering. And today he'll be talking about wet gasification for a dairy farm. So Pete, the virtual floor is yours.
Appreciate you all sticking with me. Here's the after lunch. And I guess on we go. So here's what I'm going to talk about. I think it's very important to recognize how sustainability is a need for the dairy industry. And we've already seen a number of people talking about manure treatment, and I think that's going to be our future as we look towards sustainability. And I'm going to look at wet gasification. I think it's an interesting thing that the sponsor is a financial organization, because the finances are, you can do it, but economically it may not work. So that's part of the issue. And then a little bit looking at the future. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I have been working with manure management for a long time, and when I first came to a cooperative extension and started thinking about it, I made a list of things that we needed to think about as we were doing manure management, and I put them here in what I thought was a good order, and I shared these with farms. And it was interesting to me that the farms actually put the order in reverse. That the minimizing frustration was very important. Cost was important. It's their land. It's their neighbors. Nutrients are so cheap, and it's awful hard to look at the environmental issues downstream. But we are now, and in fact, society is, and so I think everybody is looking at sustainability. And we know that there are the three legs of sustainability: economic, environment, and societal. And we kind of look back at the history of manure, and daily spread was economic, was pretty cheap to do. The society accepted it at the time, but over time we understood that it was not environmental. A lot of losses during the winter, during wet, saturated times of the year. So the nutrient losses were significant. So then we put in manure storage, and again, we thought it was economic. We thought it was environmental. However, it wasn't accepted very well by society, as the odors became significant from stored dairy manure. And if we look at the full economics of it, to deal with the environmental issues that have now developed with greenhouse gases, then we have other issues. So therefore, as we move towards sustainability, people are looking at manure treatment as a possibility to move towards sustainability. And classic, this is how I grew up. You went out, you spread manure, course, you wondered where it went, what happened, but you got rid of it. You also had problems when it was wet, saturated. You had problems in the field, both compaction, but also the nutrient losses were significant. And you all are aware of this, that dairy farms have changed, and they are achieving economies of scale. And so more and more, some of the manure treatment ideas might come into play. And if you're faced with emptying this twice a year, you try to think about ways in order to do it more effectively and more efficiently. People can put in a lot of equipment, a lot of action, make it work, and they can be quite efficient. We have new equipment, makes it easier, gently. Sometimes it's easier to get out sooner, and then you compact just as much. But the equipment is changed. Spreading manure always does have its hazards, though, and so this is an issue. And as farms grow in size, they have to go further and further out. And then also we do consider what the greenhouse gas issues are with our manure storages, so that makes treatment also something. This is an interesting graph. And basically what it's saying is that the further out you go, it's going to cost you more money. And the pumping, of course, is much cheaper, particularly as you go out further. However, it's not always feasible. You have to cross property lines, you got to cross roads, you got to do all kinds of things. So as you get larger and larger as a farm, the manure spreading costs can also increase. Pumping, though, is delightful. Incorporation is delightful. Helps deal with the odors, and the pumping costs are much less. But this does lead us to all kinds of treatment strategies. And you can only imagine the different types of systems that can be thought of. And in fact, our first keynote speaker talked about systems and talked about evaluating them and how they might fit in. And I think what's critical to know is every farm is going to be different. Every situation is going to be different of trying to achieve what you want to achieve. Typically, farms, though, seem to want to achieve a reduction in mass, also a reduction of concentration of phosphorus, so that could be moved off-site. And then there's the idea of reducing greenhouse gases, which is also coming into play. All kinds of different systems that people are thinking about, and the gasification is one of them, and it certainly has some potential, but we'll shortly see that it's so far quite expensive. Here's another scheme, again doing the same idea, is how can we end up with a liquid that we can spray irrigate close to the farm without where the vast majority of the mass goes, and then somehow come up with something that could be exported or moved off the farm, particularly that might have the phosphorus in it. In New York State, the farms are getting bigger. They seem to also be in competition for land. They are trying to experience the economies of scale. And so a farm approached us, and they had two things happen. One, they thought they were interested in expanding, and they were approached by an entrepreneur who had a system to treat manure. And so they really were interested in, does it make sense to put in a treatment system, basically to offset the added cost of hauling and spreading the additional manure. So they were looking at, they had 1,500 cows, and they were going to think about expanding 1,000 more cows with the associated heifers. So the manure amounts were going to increase, and the number of acres that they needed were also going to increase. And what the problem with that was is they were in an area with other dairies, and so there would be competition for that land, and they felt they'd have to go quite a ways. So the fields close to them were taken, so the fields further away would be what they had to do. So they knew that they would be spreading more. Already they were spreading on an average of 2.5 miles, and they felt like the average would increase to 3.6 miles. So more spreading, more distance, it'll be an increased cost. So they didn't actually go get the land, but they thought, here's what the land might be. And using those calculations, they, instead of being 217,000 a year for spreading, they thought it would be as much as 332,000 per year, so another 120,000 per year. And then also there's the time and opportunity. You know that often in the spring when you're spreading manure, you also ought to be doing other things, and delay in corn planting and delay in hay harvesting is very significant in the quality of forage that you get. So it's really important to be timely in that. And this $36 per acre, that's the cost that we figured for some of the closer farms, which would be, of course, a tractor and a spreader. And the larger cost would be those fields that we had to travel quite a distance to get to. And again, as you're adding more land, it's more and more likely that those will be the fields that you'll be adding as the ones further away. So we were able to get there. They were a CAFO farm, and so they had a comprehensive nutrient management plan. And so we got the records. Here's were the fields, were the acres in each field. And they had, of course, kept a record of the method that they used to spread on it, so we could track the costs and the spreading rate. So we knew how many loads would go, or if they were pumping, here's how long it would take to pump. And we could look at the travel path. I didn't make them tell me the travel path. I just took the most likely travel path. And in most cases, they had which equipment it was, and we applied both the capital and operating costs. And I want to make that clear that we're including the capital costs in this spread over the life, a life of the equipment, not just the operating costs. And we did not pick specific new fields, but we said the average field would be further away. And you could see what we had, and here's their home farm right here. There's their manure storage. So, you know, they definitely pumped out into here, but if they were getting to here, that might have been pumped. These fields down in here, they used the tractor spreader. But then as they went further and further out, here we're getting close to 6 miles away. As they get to these fields, they're hauling it by truck. And so they have the truck fields coming in, and of course, okay, they'd follow up this road and they'd turn down this road, then they'd go out and enter the field, and okay, so it's spreading rate at so much per acre and traveling times. So this is the different equipment types that they had. This is their tractor spreader, slinger spreader, and they rented from Ousterhout. Basically the same cost as theirs, but they did it for timely. They had manure tankers. They had trailers, which were truck-mounted trailers. And then they pumped. And the pumping system, this includes the whole drag hose, the pumps, the auxiliary pumps, the drag hose, and the tractors to horse the hose around, as well as the application. And then they had these additional tankers. And they had a different spreading width, and of course, different time in the field. Again, the field speeds were estimated. We just said, this is what we think they can do. So then the questions were, would the technology by gasifying the solids, reduce the amount of manure that they'd have to haul, and would the byproducts from that be useful, and would it all be economically feasible? We believe it, actually there is some feasibility challenges that we'll get to that. So here's the system that was proposed, and it's called wet gasification because the material going into it is still pretty wet. This diagram is based on 25% solids for the manure going into it. For our analysis, we used 30%. The entrepreneur thought that the 25% was about the break even. And you can see already that this presented a big problem because dairy manure comes out at 10% solids. So not all the manure can go through the system. So the first thing we have to do is run it through a separator, and then we're left with perhaps 20% of the mass as opposed to all the mass. So that's one of the big challenges that this system would have. So basically you put the manure in a hopper, it's fed in, they preheat it, then they devolatilization it. Basically that's the wet gasification part of it. Then it goes into an actual gasifier. They recover off of the steam that's produced. They recover the heat off of the steam. There is some exhaust, but the gas, the syngas, goes up. They again recover more heat. They recover even more heat here. And then they basically end up with an ash. Earlier we heard about biochar. This ash is not a biochar. It's much more concentrated, and it actually will dewater. So that was part of the scheme, is they could dewater this and ship it. He had people claim that they would pay $600 a ton for it as a feed additive for swine. We kind of discounted that. We didn't think very many people would buy that, so it's hard to know. And then, of course, it generated extra syngas, which we then would use to generate electricity, and we also would use some of the steam to generate electricity. We'd have 2 generator systems. So that was the scheme, and you can see that they're recovering as much heat as they can. And one of the things they're recovering up at the top, they're recovering the heat, but it's mostly a low value heat. In other words, it's not enough to run a steam engine or anything. Only a portion of it would do that. And the rest of it, you'd have to utilize in some way. And we're not sure how a dairy farm would typically utilize that. Certainly they use hot water, but they don't use that much. So they do need energy to pressurize it. So there's a parasitic heat, electricity use in it. They did preheat it, and then they actually turned it into a saturated char, which then went into the gasification system. They had significant heat exchange. The syn fuel is lower heat value than biogas. So it has hydrogen in it, it has methane in it, but it also has carbon monoxide in it, and it has a lot of carbon dioxide. So it's a pretty low grade fuel. And at this time, we're unsure that there's actually an engine generator small enough for the systems that would go on a farm that would actually run an engine generator, but we feel like that could happen. The ash, again, comes out wet, but can be easily dewatered. So if you actually were going to ship it and sell it someplace, you could dewater it and then ship it. And I talked to you already about the heat, that most of the high quality heat was reused within the system. They used propane to start the system, but after that, it would run on its own with the heat that was generated. But the low-grade heat, we didn't think there was any value to. And of course, then it would reduce the mass because you're taking it. But the mass reduction was limited because it had to be solid manure going into it.
Quick, can I interrupt for a second, Pete?
Yes, you can.
We had a question on what was the moisture content of the solids into the hopper?
Yeah, so the chart I showed was 25%, all the numbers that came with that diagram. But when we ran our the values we used to look at the economics, we used 30%. And I'll get to that shortly here.
Okay, thanks.
So the problem was the farm had sand for bedding on the high-producing cows. And there's the question that the farm asked is, okay, you know, we can't run sand through this system, and or they would have to have a sand dewatering system, and even that, you know, to remove the sand, separate the sand from the sand-laden dairy manure, that would be an additional cost. So the idea was, well, they would switch to some other organic bedding. And of course, now we're running all the solids through the system, so they couldn't use the manure solids for bedding. So they would have to actually buy in bedding. And here's where we talk about the moisture content. The entrepreneur said 25%. He was a mechanical engineer. 25% total solids to positive energy balance, and we use 30%. And of course, dairy manure is 11%. We talked about the heat being useful. Maybe you could combine it with some other enterprise where the low-grade heat, which there was quite a lot coming from it, might be useful. And we also talked a little bit about the sale of the residue, the ash. And as we'll see when we look through the finances of this situation, that's significant. If you can sell it, you've done something. If you can't sell it, it's not so much. The other issue that comes into play is the nitrogen loss. As you take the manure through this process, the nitrogen is gasified and it goes off as part of the exhaust. There's our separators. So we can easily get 30% solids from the manure by using these screw press separators. And other people, there could be ways, right, of getting it even more drier, right? You could compost it, you could dry it, and you'd end up with a higher energy balance. We didn't do that. So when we did the analysis, the system cost quite a bit. So the ended up being, we use numbers that we believe the farm could do. And so one of the numbers that we believed was they would get nothing for the ash. And so we ended up with a negative. It cost the farm to run the system. That said, we said, look at what characteristics, what could we change to make it break even? So the first thing we could do is say, well, the capital costs could be significantly different. And of course, the entrepreneur thought that it would be $1 million for the system, capital cost. And it's possible they could get a grant. It's also possible that the solid liquid separators would already be in place on a farm. So if you could do that, in other words, there would be no capital costs other than for the steam generator, then it would break even. Okay, now put the capital costs back in. And if we could get a high price for the electricity, it could break even. So if we got 15.5 cents a kilowatt hour for the electricity, it would break even. And that even includes the 3 cents per kilowatt hour we're assuming for maintenance. Anybody from Vermont, there are farms that are getting that price from an anaerobic digester. So that's not unreasonable, but in New York State, that isn't happening. Nobody's paying that kind of price for electricity. But if you could, then it would break even. So it's possible. The thing to remember, though, is here we're just separating out the solids, and that's the most significant reduction in greenhouse gases that we're doing. So it's not, you're not getting as big a benefit as you would if you ran an anaerobic digester, which is where they are getting that higher price for the electricity. So setting the electricity aside, saying you're going to get just market rates for that. If the hauling cost was significant, and this one, we all thought going into it, we just kind of thought, oh, we'll save a lot of money on hauling costs. But again, because we're only taking 20% of the mass through the system, and our assumption is, sadly, that you aren't going to be able to sell the ash, then you really needn't reduce the hauling that much. So to break even, you would break even if it cost you $2,500 per load of manure. And of course, that's not reality. So that doesn't happen. And then finally, the ash. And if we actually could sell the ash at $374 a ton, we'd break even. So that would be delightful. And again, he had somebody that said, oh, it might be worth $600. But being worth $600 and you actually getting $600 and getting $600 on all the ash that you would produce, it doesn't seem likely to us. I think that was for a swine, to supplement a swine feed. And there aren't any swine farms, there aren't any significant, gently, swine farms in New York State. So you'd have to haul it, you'd have to market it. Everybody would have to agree that that's what it was. Okay, so then we ran it 2 times. We did this whole spreadsheet with all these factors in it, plus some other factors that aren't included here, smaller ones, on both the 1,500 cow system and the 2,500 cow system. The 1,500 cow system would take 2 units. And so the capital cost was $1,000. Well, okay, so we did the 2 units, and we used costs that we thought were reasonable, what we thought would be reasonable for a dairy farm. And of course, all of these things are variable and may be different on every different farm and every different circumstance, but you have to pick a number, and we did. So we said that you'd be negative 261,000 using the numbers that we used. And then we looked at varying the numbers. For instance, here the capital costs, we thought it would be 1,000 or 1 million. What if we got it cheaper? Which is possible, right? They had a number of these that they're selling, the price might come down. And or maybe you could get grants. Anyways, based on that, you can see the sensitivity changed. You could either look at the sensitivity to see how significant that change would be, or the change in the value. So if the capital cost went down, you can see that you'd only be losing $200,000. And then we talked about also the solid liquid separator, and if that was included, and on down. And you can see that the big cost with the capital cost. Another big one is this lost opportunity cost, depending on what you thought your investment money was worth. And at that time, we were told that farms often could find things to spend on the farm that would give them a 10% return. So that's what we used in this system. But if you had money that you could borrow at 3% and use it, then you could see that it would certainly lower the loss. You're still in negative. The entrepreneur was offering the maintenance. They would do the maintenance for $25,000 a year, and we thought, well, maybe over time that could also be reduced. So each one of these is being evaluated separately, and we'll go on. Here's some additional ones. This is still the 1,500 cow scenario. And you can see one of the huge ones is this change from sand bedding. And the farm was led to believe, and some farms have shown a 7 pounds per cow difference with sand for bedding. And so, you know, if that was the case, you'd take a significant loss, and it would be a tremendous cost to the farm. So that was the biggest one. But also the loss of nitrogen, and again, we said that the nitrogen had value because they actually were using a nutrient management plan. Some farms, the nitrogen has no value because they're overloaded with nutrients and don't utilize the nitrogen in the manure. So that's where that comes in. And we did talk about the electric price. We could manipulate the electric price. You could make some differences. The steam generator, also, the one that we priced, they said it was 14% efficient. If we could work that up to 30% efficient, it would change as well. Another issue would be actually the hauling cost per load. And again, it really didn't make that much difference, and partially because so little of the manure was actually being put through the system because it had to be such a high solid content. And then, of course, the value of the ash. We said it had no value. If it really had $300 per ton value, that's a huge difference and get you down here, and you can imagine that a $600 per ton value would put you over the top. The other thing to remember is in each of these, we're evaluating them separately. So on some farms, you may have 3 or 4 or 5 positive things that would come into play that then actually would put you into the positive. So all these things need to be considered. And of course, what they really cared about was the how it would fit with the new system, with actually the 2,500 cow operation. So in this case, we had 3 units, and again, we go through the same analysis, and you can see that you end up with the same kind of sensitivity analysis. The lost opportunity costs on this page is the biggest one. And again, of course, it's the milk. How well do the cows do when they're off of the sand bedding down here? And again, the nitrogen and the value of the ash. So the economies of scale, I think partially because these are separate units. He claimed they would come in skids. Basically, you'd prepare a pad, a gravel pad for it. You'd hook it up to the electricity, and you'd end up with a package that would come in. And so whether you put 2 in or 3 in, same kind of difference. So we went through this economics, and our conclusion was, and the farm's conclusion, that they weren't going to proceed with this. Having said that, depending on where you are and what's going on and the prices, the variable prices in here, it actually could be positive. And I would argue that we're heading in the right direction. Unfortunately, though, the reduction in manure hauling was not the driver. There was some savings, but not significant. There also was plenty of low-grade heat, 10.5 million BTUs per hour. That's a lot of heat, but we couldn't find a use for it. The farm couldn't find a use for it. And then a big question was the ash sales. Could you sell it, and would there be a market, and would there be a significant, was the market, did you have enough confidence in that market to actually justify your expectation and to deal with and again, it was a significant capital cost. However, if we had farms without sand for bedding, that takes a big part of it out. So that would be good. If we were in a drier climate, and think of some of those Southwest farms where the manure, they can kind of spread it out and all of it could run through the system. Then there'd be some significant changes in the amount of manure that would be processed. The heat benefits might work better for swine. You have to heat some of the swine operations, and certainly some of the poultry operations you heat. And in fact, there are some, or had been some, pyrolysis or gasification systems on poultry farms. And so I think that certainly could be useful. The other thing is it is possible that you could use the heat. Maybe you'd hook up with a greenhouse system, maybe you'd hook up with grain drying or wood drying, and maybe you could even have adsorption chillers possibly to hook up with some enterprise that really had a lot of cooling needs. We definitely thought of the poultry manure, since it's excreted drier, would fit this quite well. There could be significant synergies with aerobic digestion as well. The syngas with low heat value, it's going to be hard to run an engine generator with that, but if you mixed it with a biogas from anaerobic digestion, you could get a higher heating value, a higher energy value of the gas, and you could run an engine generator much easier. And it's interesting, you'd run it through the anaerobic digester, and biologically you'd get the energy you could, but then after solid separation, the carbon that remains that is not digestible, but then you could run it through the gasifier and actually get the benefit from that as well. So there's many variables, and I think this is in every one of these that we do, whether we do a greenhouse gas calculation, whether you do a system analysis, there's any number of variables that come into play. We were even asked, would it be a reduction in the organic matter? Would the soil health suffer if we're running it through a system like this and not being able to recycle the carbon back into the soil? But our farms in the Northeast are too wet. The manure comes out too wet, so the system will only work on the separated solids, therefore it didn't have that big of an impact. And we already talked about the poultry farms. Certainly there's beef operations where the manure is solid, and certainly in arid places the dairies could benefit. The byproduct production, you notice we kind of minimalized. We said, well, we can't get a benefit from the heat. Our energy in New York State, they're not paying anything extra for the renewable energy even from anaerobic digestion at this time. Nutrients are pretty cheap, and nobody yet is putting a price on the externalities of those nutrients and the losses that might occur. So that didn't work, and so the ash also we're questioning how much the value, where's the market? So we're still looking for an ideal manure management system. We still think that manure treatment is in our future. And so our conclusions are, and I think we all know this, animal agriculture does affect the environment, and we've got to work hard to minimize that. We are going to be in a situation where more storage is needed, and then the manure hauling, the manure spreading will be more significant. Gently, right now in New York State, we spread manure both in the fall and the winter. Fall and the spring. And you kind of got to ask yourself, where do we think the nutrients are going when we spread in the fall? So I believe over time we'll be spreading all our manure in the spring and when we can in the summer. And that'll create a even larger labor and time constraint, make it even more useful then to reduce the mass, to somehow be able to spread it quicker. And then odor control will continue to be needed. The drag hose systems certainly help with odor control. You're drag hosing and injecting it directly, but there still are fields where you can't do that. And so the odor will be needed. I think treatment is, again, in our future. We need to, though, develop benefits that offset the costs. All of these treatment technologies do take costs. They take capital costs. They're going to take management costs. They're going to take labor costs. So we need to develop benefits from them. And of course, a multi-disciplined approach is going to be needed. It's got to work in the whole system and not just, oh, here, put this in, but how does that impact up and down the system? And my favorite, more research is needed. And now I guess I'm ready for questions, if there are any.
Thank you. That was great. We did have some questions about the moisture content at different stages. And I think I'm not a gasification expert, so I wasn't sure if I was translating correctly. If you can see the chat.
Right. So it'd be interesting, if you did more effort, right, to dry it. And there was some thought that the waste heat might be used to dry more manure, or the separated solids dry it down, which then would make it more efficient as it went through the system. He did say there was a limit to how dry you'd want it in his system, which was the wet gasification. Another process, pyrolysis or regular gasification, the drier you get, I think the better, because then you're using less energy to evaporate the water.
Okay. Becky, if you're still on, did that get to the heart of the question?
Yeah, I think someone was asking what the total solid, Peter, what the total solids content, and if you needed a dryer. And my comment was that you could probably hit 30% total solids, which is the same thing as 70% moisture with a separator.
Yes.
But I think Peter answered that you could go farther with a dryer. I think, right, Peter? I'm not trying to, if I got that right, but that at some point with wet gasification, you don't want to get much drier than.
Right. In fact, we have some farms now with a screw press separator. They're getting it down to 35% solids. Interesting low. Then they don't. It's not 20% of the mass anymore, right? It's a less percentage of the total amount that they get to that.
All right, any more questions? Feel free to put them in the chat, guys.
Yeah, I can say this was an interesting thing to go through. And a couple things made it interesting. One was the entrepreneur. He was very excited and very interested, and then a little disappointed in our results. And the other one was just the number of variables that had to be considered. we charged $2 per ton loss of organic matter. We had to insure, there's $5,000 in there to insure the equipment. Just things just build on what you need to consider when you think of it as a whole system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what were some of the uses for the ash that you could see, and why he thought he was getting such a high value?
Well, again, so it had high phosphorus and high potassium, and I'm pretty sure they thought that the phosphorus content was what as a feed additive for swine. That's where he was going. But of course, it would be good for fertilizer as well. So that's part of it. It would be, since it's dewatered, you could chip it and actually handle it quite easily. He said it would handle as a granularly. Now, we never did get a sample of it, though. It was all what he thought it would do.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again, Mr. Wright and Compeer Financial for presenting and sponsoring the session. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, Chelsea.